Good afternoon. Welcome to the Washington Institute. Welcome to our Schreiber Family Conference Center in our newly acquired offices here at 1111 19th Street. I'm delighted to welcome all of you to this event. I'm Rob Satloff, the director of the Washington Institute. It is a sign of how much things have changed in the Middle East, that there is a room full of knowledgeable Middle East observers to attend a session in 2015 on the theme, Russia's military escalation in Syria. This would not have been a topic on anyone's agenda at any point in the last 30, 40 years. How far back should we go? But it is very much a topic on the world agenda today. Today, both President Obama and President Putin jousted with each other at the United Nations on this issue, throwing barbs back and forth against each other on their various strategies. Only one of them, of course, is now significantly deploying military power inside Syria to affect the balance of power on the ground, and that's really what brings us together today. To address what drives Russian policy in Syria and its environs, what in fact are the Russians doing in Syria, what the implications are likely to be for the broader conflict in Syria and its neighbors, and ultimately what, if anything, the United States can, will, and should do to address this even more complicated problem than the one we faced a year or two ago. We're very fortunate that the Washington Institute has on its staff a broad array of expertise that can bring to bear on each aspect of this Russia in Syria problem that I just referred to. And so I'm proud to be able to introduce the members of this panel. Some of you may know before, and some of you I'm going to be introducing here at the Institute for the first time. So the order of today is not exactly the way people are sitting, but you'll get the drift very quickly. On the far left is Jeff White. Jeff is a defense fellow here at the Washington Institute, a longtime analyst at the Defense Intelligence Agency. Jeff is going to go into some detail and bring actual facts to bear on, I know that may be unusual for some people, but he's going to bring actual facts to bear on what the Russians are doing on the ground in Syria. Second, we're going to turn to Anna Borshchevskaya. Anna is our Ira Wiener Fellow here at the Washington Institute, focusing specifically on Russian Middle East policy. And Anna is going to delve into the political and strategic aspects of what the Russians are up to and their broader implications. Speaking third is going to be Andrew Tabler. Andrew is our Martin Gross Fellow here at the Washington Institute, longtime Syria watcher, building on years of on-the-ground experience in that country. And Andrew is going to talk about the diplomacy of that the United States is trying to engage in, what the status of U.S. efforts are, both on the ground and in the diplomatic arena regarding Syria. And then fourth, I'm very pleased to introduce Fabrice Balanche. Fabrice just arrived at the Washington Institute, where he is a visiting fellow. Fabrice is a professor of political science at the University of Lyon, and Fabrice has rather unique insights based on his years of study of domestic politics inside Syria, including years spent in Latakia, traveling in and around Syria, a rather unique set of insight, observations, and experience that will help round out this, I think, rather comprehensive discussion of the situation of Russian deployment in Syria and its implications for the broader conflict. So with that, I'm going to turn first to Jeff and then to the rest of my colleagues.
Okay, thank you, Rob. Get these slides going here. Let's see.
There you go.
Okay.
Potential effects of the war. Is that the first one? There you go. Back. There you go.
Okay. All right. Well, this is me. It's interesting to work on the Russians in Syria now because one of the our first crises or situations I worked in the Middle East in the intelligence community was a Russian intervention in Egypt, the Suez Canal War, the challenge posed to the Israelis.
Jeff, directly with the mic, please. Jeff.
Okay. The challenge posed to the Israelis by the Russian presence in Egypt and so on. So it's kind of fun in a way to come back to a situation like this where the Russians are actually deploying significant military power into Syria. There are a lot of reasons have been put out for why the Russians would do this. Some of it sounds to me like international relations 101, right, where everything is compartmented into nice little packages of reasons to explain behavior. But to me, the essential reason here, the proximate reason, the main reason here is to support the regime. And by support to the regime, I mean the intention to fight on the side of the regime against the regime's enemies and to change the military situation inside Syria. All these other reasons are useful to think about, can be debated. They're being wildly debated even as we speak right now. But the main reason they're putting combat forces in significant numbers into Syria is to fight on the side of the regime. I think that's, to me, that's evident in the nature of their buildup. Okay, how are they doing this? They are bringing stuff in by sea. They've created a sea bridge, which is ongoing as of today. They have a number of amphibious ships or landing ships involved in this, Alligator class and Rapucha class landing ships. There's one on his way down now. The picture in the upper right shows the Alligator class ship that is inbound to Latakia right now, or may even have arrived. And they also are using a significant air bridge, right? They're flying transport-type aircraft of the Russian Air Force every day, maybe multiple times a day in some cases, into Syria. They're using a variety of aircraft that allows them to bring in both personnel and heavy equipment. And a lot of the stuff that we think has arrived there probably came by air. Most of the stuff coming down is coming down from Russia through Iran, through Iran into Iraq, across Iraq, and into Syria. And the picture on the lower right is from Saturday, and it shows an AN-124 Condor heavy transport inbound to Latakia. And we're seeing this going, as I said, going on every day. Some estimates have 50 flights so far in there. I'll give you the size of some scope of the buildup that's going on. There's no indication that they're stopping the airlift, and they've also used the airlift to mask the movement of fighter aircraft. They put 4 or so fighter aircraft up with the transport. The transport aircraft will use its transponder. The fighter aircraft will not use the transponder, and that way they were able to bring in 28 combat aircraft with virtually unnoticed, at least by many people. I'm assuming that the U.S. intelligence community had a better idea of that than people outside the community, but I can't say for sure. The facilities they're using is the main one for the air operation is Basel al-Assad International Airport in Latakia. It has been significantly upgraded in terms of the logistics facilities there, improvements to the pads and additional pads for helicopters to be there. It's the main logistics base in terms of the air operation. They've also created a helicopter base at a place called Istamo. It's a former Syrian military storage depot. They have combat helicopters there, and transport helicopters there. So they have 2 air bases essentially operating inside Syria and Latakia province. And there's now discussion going on in terms of the people who look at this stuff that there may be 2 other air facilities inside Syria. Unconfirmed, but more may be going on than just what we see in Latakia province. They're also using both the ports of both Latakia and Tartus to bring in the heavy stuff, the heavy equipment, and that's basically the central point of the air bridge or sea bridge, excuse me. This is the order of battle that we can see so far inside Syria. The Su-30SMs is a multi-role combat aircraft with precision targeting capability. The flanker is a long-range strike and interdiction aircraft. The Su-25 Frogfit is basically a close air support aircraft, somewhat analogous to our A-10 aircraft. I have one drone on the slide here, but there's actually 3 Russian drones have now been identified operating in Syrian airspace, primarily over Idlib province. For support, they've got an IL-20 Kut, SIGINT, ELINT type collector. Can do some other things as well. And there's some tentative evidence of a possible airborne command post also operating inside Syria. So this is not a small effort. It's not huge by our standards, especially, but it's a nice, potent package. Gives them a lot of different options. On the ground, what we believe to be the case is that there are elements of the 810th Naval Infantry Brigade. This is also a fairly significant combat force for the Russians to commit in there. Possible elements of the 363rd Naval Infantry Brigade as well. And by elements, I mean maybe up to battalion size, maybe a little more. It's not the full brigade. It may be headed to be the full brigade, but it's not the full brigade yet. They put in T-90 tanks, which is their most modern tank other than the brand new Armada. Nobody in Syria has this tank. It'll be the best tank on the Syrian battlefield unless the United States puts some of our tanks in there. The BTR-80 APC, it's an amphibious armor personnel carrier that's associated with naval infantry, and it includes the BTR-82A, a more advanced version of that vehicle. They have two batteries of field artillery have been identified, and at best estimates are maybe between 2,000 and 4,000 troops, maybe not that high, but fairly significant number of troops as well. Interestingly, they have reportedly deployed the SA-22 SAM system, very capable, very modern system. It has both gun and missile capabilities, short to medium range. This is a weapon that would be a threat to any aircraft operating in the area. We have not seen the SA-22 on satellite imagery, at least in the public domain. But it is supposed to be there. And we believe there also is a command and control structure. The Russians would not deploy those kinds of forces in there without having some way to coordinate operations between the ground forces and the air element. Some pieces of this have been identified in terms of mobile command vehicles. And also there's at least some imagery evidence of maybe 5 command and control stations inside Latakia province. So again, this is a kind of a well-rounded out capability, let's say. Potential missions that I can see doesn't mean they'll do all of these. It doesn't mean they're doing them. It definitely doesn't mean they're doing them now. But these are things they could do with that force, in my mind. Reconnaissance, for sure. This is already underway. We're getting a lot of reporting of Russian Air Force reconnaissance activity over Syria, especially in Idlib province, but also now we're hearing that they're flying as far as Dar ez-Zor and Abu Kamal out on the Iraqi border, and even have penetrated Iraqi airspace in the conduct of those operations. So they're collecting information basically on the environment they may have to fight in. Close air support for sure. The Su-25s are definitely a good platform for doing that. They have 12 of them there. That could be important on a lot of battlefields. Strike, the Su-24s, and interdiction. The Su-24s are quite capable of that. They can range across most of Syria for sure. And it's a good platform. It also has precision strike capability, so they can hit things on the ground other than towns and cities, which is the specialty of the Syrian Air Force. On the ground, you can see these roles for them. Advising, they're probably already doing that and have been doing it for some time, and especially at the higher levels of Syrian command. I don't think at the tactical level. Embedding, that's putting a small Russian unit into a larger Syrian regime unit. They may be doing that. We have some evidence of that in Latakia province. They may have actually put their troops in with the regime forces. Security, we're getting some reporting that Russian troops are deployed in Latakia city on roadblocks and pulling internal security missions. There's a lot of Russians now being reported in the hotels and so on in Latakia. More, in a sense, on a larger scale, they could also engage in defensive actions on the ground and offensive actions, on the ground. That would be their main fighting role if they get to it. We're also getting some reporting. I don't consider it really solid, but that Russian Special Forces troops are active in Syria in a number of places and conducting Special Forces type missions. This is what I sort of think about as in terms of where would they operate. I think what we're talking about is selective employment, right? The Russians, at least for sure with the size of the force they have now, aren't going to go everywhere to fight everybody. They will prioritize missions. They will go to the priority enemies of the regime. They will go and fight against the main threats to the regime, whether that's ISIS, JN, or some other element of the rebel forces. And they'll employ tailored packages to do that based on whatever the mission is. Maybe mostly air initially, but also possibly ground forces involved in that. The key areas that I can see right now for them to fight in are in northern Latakia, and where we actually have evidence that they are deployed and doing stuff now. Northern Hama, which is a big problem for the regime. The Damascus region, maybe not because of the complexity of the fighting there. Aleppo, the regime does not want to lose Aleppo. Its hold there is tenuous, but they still have a chunk of it. We've already had some reporting that Russian combat forces have been involved in an effort to relieve a regime garrison in the Aleppo area. Unconfirmed, and personally I doubt it, but people are already talking about Russian ground forces getting out on the ground. And then in eastern Homs, especially in the area of the gas fields, which the regime is constantly fighting for, constantly trying to protect from ISIS. So those are some areas. You can look at almost any point on the Syrian geography where the rebels are strong as a potential area for the regime forces to show up. So this is what the effects I think they would have, or could have. They can provide a decisive edge on select battlefields, right? They're not big enough now to roll the rebellion back and reconquer all the territory for the Syrian regime. That's not in the cards, at least with the kind of forces we see now. And I don't think the Russians are going to deploy an army into Syria. But on certain battlefields, and really important battlefields, they could be decisive. For example, if they deploy the kind of force they seem to be developing in Syria, I don't think the regime would have lost Idlib province. That's the kind of change I think Russian forces could make if they're built up to the right size and so on. They can increase the attrition on opposition forces. Part of a good bit of the Syrian war is a war of attrition. The day-to-day, month to month, whatever, wearing down of the other guy's forces. And this is one of the main factors that's going to determine the outcome of the war. And it's this balance that the Russian forces could shift in favor of the regime. Indirect effects. I think they can raise the combat effectiveness of the regime forces. Right. This is through embedding, advising, and so on, providing intelligence. And when you look at the combat effectiveness of all the forces inside Syria, they're pretty well balanced. It's not clear that one group has a big edge in combat effectiveness or military effectiveness or over any other. So the Russians coming in, they could shift this combat effectiveness or military effectiveness equation. They could raise the morale of the forces or the regime forces and so on. There's a lot of discussion now that thousands of jihadis are going to come sweeping out of Syria and storm the Russians and throw them out. Maybe, maybe not. There's this discussion of the Afghanistan scenario being repeated. Personally, I tend to doubt it. I don't think the Russians are in there for that kind of war. I think they've learned a lot, and I'm not so sure we'll see that many jihadis eager to engage the Russians. And finally, just for some conclusions, it's a small, I think, but capable joint combined arms force. It gives the Russians a lot of options, military options inside Syria. My own sense is it's tailored for regime support. It's not tailored to deliver humanitarian goods. It's not specifically tailored to fight ISIS. It's not tailored to overthrow the Syrian regime. It's there to support the regime and to fight for it. It can be expanded, right? What we see now is not a slow buildup exactly, but a steady and methodical buildup. The Russians have the capability to increase the airlift, increase the sea lift, and put more troops in, more weapons in, and so on. As I said, it can have significant effects on the battlefield. What no one is talking about, that I've seen anyway, is that it can give the Russians a piece of the direction of the war. And that is, if the Russians have combat forces in there fighting, conducting operations, they are going to be part of the Syrian, Iranian, Hezbollah, whatever it is, command structure. And this will influence the shape and nature of the war. And my colleagues will address the question of the political effects, but obviously this has already had significant political effects, and I think it will continue, and they may grow. And with that, we'll save questions for later.
Great. Thank you very much, Jeff. Anna.
Thank you. Let me start by highlighting just a few points from Putin's speech at the UN General Assembly. Because I think while there weren't any surprises in his talk, it's very indicative of Putin's approach to the Middle East. It's consistent with his approach in recent years. One point that Putin made is he talked about a single center of dominance that emerged in the post-Cold War world that did not have to reckon with the UN. And this was a veiled reference to the United States to the West. He talked about what an enormous mistake it is not to cooperate with Assad. And he also talked about military coups orchestrated from the outside, which again is a veiled reference to how Putin perceives Western involvement in international affairs, his belief that so-called colored revolutions throughout the post-Soviet space, but also protest movements in the Middle East have been orchestrated by the West. With that in mind, let me turn to several goals that I think Putin has in Syria. The first is to deflect from the Ukraine crisis and bring himself out of international isolation by pointing to a common enemy, the Islamic State, to essentially say, we may have our differences, but global terror is a greater threat, and so we need to cooperate to work against it together, essentially legitimizing his autocracy by doing that. And he didn't need to reference Ukraine directly in his speech to indicate that this is what he's trying to do. He is also trying to position Russia as a great power, one with which the United States has to speak with on equal terms. He wants to reduce the influence of the West. His approach to diplomacy is zero-sum. We've seen President Obama say just today that we all have a stake in each other's success. Putin doesn't see it that way. Of course, he wants to further continue the conflict in Syria by propping up Assad and blocking any real solution to the crisis. He also wants to project Russia's naval power beyond the Black Sea. One of the things Putin has done is one of his key priorities is to expand Russia's naval presence beyond its traditional presence, and the Tartus naval facility in Syria will help him do that. We've also seen him conduct, for the first time, naval military exercises in Egypt over the summer, and that's consistent with his approach. What he's also doing is he's testing the West. This is also consistent with Kremlin behavior. He wants to see how far he can go before there's any pushback, and so far there's been none. And what I think is really important here is Russia's domestic situation. This is what I'd like to turn to for the remainder of my talk. Putin annexed Crimea from Ukraine at a time when his approval ratings were at their low point. They were still in the majority, but they were low majorities. The economy was already in a downward spiral. The population has been in a steady decline for years. There's been a number of domestic problems. And so by pointing out to a nationalist sentiment, by getting people to rally around the flag, his approval ratings shot up immediately to 80–90%. The problem with doing that is if you're going to embark on this path, this can only last so long. So you're going to need to keep inventing crises. You need to keep that momentum going. And so involvement in Syria fits very well with how to do that. In the long run, I think Russia's Syria adventure could actually turn out very badly for Russia itself. Russia's military forces already have many problems. Russia's military spending is unsustainable. Russia could find its military stretched too thin. And Putin is aware of this. In May of this year, he amended an existing decree on state secrets. What he did is he's put Russia's military losses on the list of state secrets, even in peacetime during what's called special operations. This is one way he's managed to hide the true number of casualties in Ukraine, and will likely do that in Syria as well. However, the problem again, with hiding body bags is you can only do that for so long. And what's interesting to me is immediately when the news of Russia's buildup in Syria hit the press, Russia's liberal elites unanimously spoke out against what Putin is doing, and all of them recalled Russia's experience in Afghanistan. Now, this may be a different situation for many reasons, but what's interesting is that for Russians themselves, this immediately invoked memories of Afghanistan and how damaging this will be for the country. Also, don't forget, terrorism is what propelled Putin into power. There were a series of apartment bombings in Moscow on the eve of the first presidential election in 2000, and Putin's approval ratings again had shot up from very low to very, very high. He emerged as a strong leader who stood up against terrorism. So again, this is not, in a sense, new, and it fits with Russia's domestic context. Russia is not a strong country by a lot of indicators. Its GDP dwarfs, compares to the side of the West, its population, its demographics, and so forth. So for years, the West has dismissed Russia as weak. The problem is that weak countries can sometimes be the most dangerous, because it's out of Russia's weakness that it's acting out aggressively. It's doing that in Ukraine, it's doing that in other countries in post-Soviet space, and it's doing that in Syria. So more broadly, what is Putin trying to do throughout the Middle East, not just in Syria, but broadly in the region? Again, reduce influence of the West and position himself as a counterweight to the West. Essentially, it's a case of a country that I think playing a weak hand, but it's playing it very well because there's lack of political will on the part of the West to do anything about it. And so far, he's been very successful. And I think, I think we'll keep seeing that trajectory in the near future unless there are any major changes. And that's all I have.
Okay, thank you, Anna. Andrew.
First of all, welcome to the Washington Institute's new space. It's great to be here with all my colleagues at such an interesting time. I'm going to try and tackle a little bit about what we know coming out of diplomatic circles concerning Syria, and I think from earlier this year, as the opposition has pushed the Assad regime's forces into another, be described as regime contraction. There's been considerable talk about U.S.-Russian convergence on Syria. And there are a lot of reasons for that. In January and April, Russia, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, to be specific, held 2 rounds of peace talks in Moscow that failed to yield any results, with the last one going particularly badly, and I'll talk a little bit more about that. And so after this failure and the Assad regime's battlefield failures, there were some follow-up meetings in May, and particularly one between Secretary of State John Kerry and Russian President Vladimir Putin, that were supposedly about Russia and the U.S. moving toward each other on 2 main issues, and there was talk of an area of convergence. One was on the flow of foreign fighters going to and coming back from Syria, and 2 was the need to pressure the Assad regime into a diplomatic end to the Syria conflict based on Assad's transition from power. Now, the reason why is that during the second peace talks in Moscow in April, Russian officials and others flew to Damascus and spoke with President Assad ahead of the meeting and asked for 2 things. One was for Bashar al-Jafari not to head the delegation, and I think that's pretty well known. The other one was to make some much more significant confidence-building measures on the release of political prisoners, which had been requested by a number of those who were going to be attending the peace talks from the opposition side. When the peace talks interrupt the peace talks, the plane lands in Moscow, and the door opens up, and Bashar al-Jafari gets off the plane. Second, during the peace talks, the regime released a few people from jail, but not the ones that the opposition really wanted to be released from jail, thus giving the opposition representatives very, very little diplomatically. And the talks very quickly broke down. They were supposed to tackle 4 different issues, and they really didn't get off the ground substantially. So it's into that. That's ultimately where, in terms of tracking this, where the Putin-Kerry meeting came from. But what's interesting is if you look at that, which was only a few months ago, now we have a significant, large Russian military buildup in Syria, designed to now, in terms of what we heard from President Putin at the UN, was to fight terrorists and also to prop up a legitimate state. And the idea is what produced this. So just give you a little bit of background, for the past 2 years, at the invitation of the Russian Ministry of Defense, I've traveled to Moscow to attend their annual security conference and to engage Russian officials and intellectuals on this very subject. You probably noticed that I didn't really write anything about that after those 2 trips, and the reason is that it was very difficult for me to determine what actually was going on. I don't think there was anything more sophisticated than there was what I could detect as a major difference in the way that different Russian policy centers looked at Syria. The one the well-known position is that of the Foreign Ministry, and which was headed by Foreign Minister Lavrov, and these were tied to Putin's statements that basically that the Russian Federation was not wedded to Assad and willing to negotiate, and it seemed as if we were heading into another round of these negotiations after President Assad was so rigid at the Moscow talks in April. But beside those statements from the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, we had a very different narrative, and that was coming from the Ministry of Defense. And they were outlined at the 2 conferences that I attended, and there have been a variety of articles out there, and basically the way it was outlined on a number of PowerPoint presentations, which are on the internet, and I encourage you to look at them, is one. The post-Cold War world has been dominated by one power, this unipolar world, which Anna talked about. Two, and I think this goes back actually not just this year, but 2 years, the problem is not the Arab Spring per se. The problem is the U.S. response to the Arab Spring. And that this response to the Arab Spring was actually part of what was described on these slides as a policy of color revolutions. And they basically function as the following, that these color revolutions get people to fight each other domestically. The military is used to shoot people of their own country and not a foreign invader. And that overall it was a very low-cost way of creating instability, because in the middle of all this mix, suddenly the United States would ask for a UN Security Council resolution which would justify some sort of intervention. And this is the intellectual background to the real concerns about U.S. Intervention in Libya. The third part of the argument was that these spaces, these broken states where these color revolutions are going on, either A, create illegitimate governments, like in the case of Ukraine, or B, terrorists or long-term terrorist safe havens. And this fundamentally, the Ministry of Defense outlined, was not in the interest not only of Russia but also the international community. Now, it's at that point that they moved in then to a prescriptive discussion, and this was on point 4, that the answer to this is what was referred to as military-to-military cooperation. And it's basically helping sovereign states essentially shoot your way out of these crises. This is not exactly new. It's not exactly, the Assad regime has been doing this for some time, but basically the argument was that the basis of an intervention should be on the basis of a sovereign state, except in the case of Ukraine, where the government is not legitimate because the Maidan protests were a coup. So this is where, if you're trying to square, Syria and Russia's Syria and Ukraine policies, it's based on that thing. They see the Assad regime as legitimate, and the government in Kiev is illegitimate. All based on how power was taken. I joked at the time that I guess they had never observed a Assad regime election before, but in any case, this division in Russian policy circles were personified by 2 individuals, some of whom are known to this audience. One was Vitaly Nomkin of the Russian Academy for Sciences. Vitaly, very well-known figure, very skilled in the Middle East, has been here to Washington a number of times. He was assisting the Ministry of Defense in terms of putting together these conferences. The other intellectual who backs up, it seems, the Ministry of Defense's arguments is that of Evgeny Satanovsky, who is from the Institute of Middle East Studies, well-known figure. And the reason why I say Evgeny is backing up the Ministry of Defense's positions is because actually during this year's conference, the Deputy Defense Minister called on him from the audience to get with his microphone in to give a small speech. And during the speech, he said that the problem was not the Arab Springs, but rather the United States reactions to the Arab Spring in and of itself. Anyways, out of this intellectual discourse, and policy discourse, it seems that the Ministry of Defense's view has prevailed. And thus we have a significant shift in Russia's Syria policy with very deep implications for the conflict and probably the Middle East as a whole. So in terms of a few of them, I know we'll get into this in the question and answer session as well. In terms of constraints, I think we have now pretty serious impediment to the Western and regional strategy to place military pressure on Assad in order to induce political concession that would lead to Assad's departure. I can't see President Assad becoming significantly more flexible now, given this intervention. Especially, I'm a big believer after living in Syria for a long time that people only make choices when they have to, and they have to face a real dilemma. I don't think Assad faces a dilemma of losing power, and I don't think the Alawi community does as well. And that creates some complications, not impossible, but complications. 2, in terms of constraints, great power intervention in Syria now makes this, I think, a global crisis. Not that it wasn't before, and many of us have argued about that. And this is where we get into the recent discussions between the Russian Ministry of Defense and the Pentagon over what they call deconfliction. And this is because of the real risk of the military escalation by the United States or anyone else could run into conflict with Russian forces there, and that could lead to a great power military conflict if not kept in check. I think three, it also complicates diplomacy on Syria because it verifies for us very clearly that Washington and Moscow are on very different pages in terms of an end state in Syria, right? I think this is, the discussion about whether the Russians and the United States see the conflict differently. I think that's over. In terms of opportunities, Russia, like Iran, who has also intervened in Syria, I think they're now I think they are wedded to Bashar al-Assad and the regime, whether they like it or not. They might not say that, but I think once you get involved with the kind of capabilities that Jeff was outlining, it's very difficult to pull back without significant embarrassment and a lot of other implications. And now during this, it is possible that they could bring their influence to bear on Assad if the Russian position in Syria were called into question or under attack by some of the forces that or operations that Jeff outlined. I'm talking about jihadis gravitating towards the Russian forces, but although it's hard to see the Russians not escalating. The question is if there is any daylight in terms of Russian thinking between Assad and the Syrian regime. Russia talks oftentimes about avoiding state collapse. But essentially, we're talking here about about partial preservation of the Syrian regime, and I think this is where it's not clear. Certainly, from Iranian circles, you hear that the regime that the Syrian regime is an inverted pyramid. You remove the capstone, and the whole thing falls apart. It's unclear to me from my conversations with Russians if they see it the same way. Some people would like to preserve the regime at the expense of Assad and his family, but others fear that the way the regime is constructed is indeed makes it galvanized, or makes that it gives us a structure that resists a peaceful transition. I think Russian intervention will not end the war, but there could be a silver lining in this. Russia could help stabilize some areas that are under the regime's control in order to avoid the much feared jihadist takeover of Damascus. Now, I'm not saying that I'm not advocating on their behalf. I'm not saying that the jihadists are going to take over Damascus. I was always doubting that. But on the bright side, if the United States is worried less about Damascus falling to the jihadists, perhaps they can turn their attention to actually stabilizing the other parts of Syria that are under the opposition's control, and that might be a good thing out of all this. And last but not least, I think that Russia's intervention on behalf of Bashar al-Assad means that Syria will be partitioned for the foreseeable future, if not permanently. Iranian and Russian logic is to prop up the Assad regime in the West, but neither I don't think, and I agree with Jeff on this, I don't think that they're able to commit the kind of forces that would retake all of Syrian territory. I still, in terms of discussions about ISIS and what to do about it, I often ask the question, what force is going to go into the Euphrates Valley and root out ISIS? And I don't think the Russian force is going to be the one that's doing it. I don't think an Iranian force is going to be doing it. The question is, can we all find a force that could do that? I think we're years away from that, and unfortunately, I see many black days ahead in the Syrian war. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Andrew. Fabrice, some good news.
With these refugees, we know that there is families, rebel families. The men are fighting, and the family are in Latakia. And in Latakia in June, there was a very huge threat, a huge fear about the fifth column. Does it mean if with these refugees there is people from Daesh, there is people from Nusra, and they are waiting the good moment to make an uprising. It's like this that the Syrian army lost Palmyra, because in fact since few months people from Daesh enter in Palmyra like refugees, like civilians, and when Daesh attacked Palmyra by the north and by the west part, the Syrian army was trying to contain the Daesh fighter, but in the back there was also Daesh fighters going out from the houses, and it was impossible to protect the city. Is it working? I was put the first one. Yeah. Okay. And after I will. And the north of the Alawite mountain is also underpopulated. Alawite villages are empty because you have a strong immigration to Latakia and Damascus since about 50 years, since the Ba'ath Party is at the power, because it's more easy for the Alawite to get a job in the army, in the secret service, or in the administration. So now in the villages, I don't see. So I'll come back a little bit. Yeah. So this is the maps of the divided Syria. In red you have the governmental zone, in yellow the Kurdish zone, in black Daesh, and in green the other rebels, but that means mostly Nusra and their allies. This is the map of the sect in Syria. You can see the minority mostly on the west part of Syria, and if we compare with where the Syrian army is located, you can see that there is a very clear parallel between minority presence and Syrian army, and where it's mostly Sunni, it's Daesh and al-Nusra who's controlling the field. So this is the map of Latakia. In yellow the Alawite, in green the Sunni. The city is clearly divided in two parts. There is a very few mixed area in Latakia, like everywhere in Syria. The mixed area, it's wealthy people, because more poor you are, more sectarian you are. And this is the map of the Syrian coast, yellow the Alawites, and at the north of Latakia you can see the presence of Sunni, Hafez, Jebel Akrad, with direct threat to Latakia city. Two maps about the demographic growth in the Syrian coast in the 70s and in the 90s. You can see that the decline of the Alawite fertility. That's why also the villages are empty in the mountain, because Alawite are making 2 or 3 children, no more. In comparison, in Raqqa or in Derzor, the fertility rate is about 8 children per woman. That's why you have also is surprising, because if the Alawite are only 10% of the population, no, Christian 5%, it's sure it's after 20 years there will be no more altogether the minority no more than 15%. And in comparison with the very dynamic demography of the Sunni, the power must change. Or, as said Bertolt Brecht, if the people are not for you, you have to change the people. That's why you have so many refugees outside Syria, because the strategy of Assad is to push out about 5 or 6 million of people, 5 or 6 million of Sunni people, of course. Like this you can rebalance the equilibrium of the demography. Why Alawite are not making so much children? No, but because they benefit from the development policy of the Ba'ath Party. This policy was, of course, concentrated on the Alawites. After Assad created university in Latakia, developed the education in Latakia. Why? Not because he loved his community, but just because he needed officer, he needs civil servant from his community to control Syria. But the consequence of this social development for the Alawite community, it's when you are going to the university, you don't make 8 children, you make just 2 or 3. And now it's a problem. If Bashar al-Assad complained because his army lack of fuel, it's because there is no any more young male Alawite ready to go to fight. They prefer to be teacher, engineer, but not to work in the military jobs. And in August 2013, there was a massacre in the Alawite mountain, a village is named Aramo, at the east of Latakia. Rebels come from the Jebel Akrad and kill about 150 people and take took in a stage about 200 people, women and children. And until now, these people are still hostage. It's impossible in Syria to speak about Aramo, because it's a shame for Bashar al-Assad, this story, because he was not able to protect his own community. And the Alawites say to Bashar al-Assad, we don't want anymore another Aramo. If there is another massacre, it's sure that you will have a lot of Alawite soldiers, Alawite officers, who will let Damascus, who will let Aleppo, and will come back to the coast to protect their villages. That's why in spring, when Jessel Shogur fall, many officers say to Assad, you must protect the coast, because if you don't protect the coast, we will protect ourselves the coast. What does it mean? We abandon Damascus and we come back to the coast. And he decided to build a new militia, the shell of the coast, but it not succeed very much. And I think it's a good reason for Mr. Putin to send troops now in Latakia, because there is a threat that Latakia fall in the arm of the rebels, because the Syrian army is clearly unable alone to protect Latakia. And Damascus homes are protected by the Hezbollah, by Iran, because it's strategically very important for the Hezbollah and Iran to be in Damascus, to be close to the Golan, and to be in the periphery of Lebanon, to protect what I call the Hezbollah land, the Lebanon. And Latakia is not so strategic for Iran. It's more strategic for Russia, because you have the military base in Tartus for the Russian Navy, and you have the international airport of Latakia, and the Russian want also to rebuild an old submarine base in Jableh. Jableh, it's a small city at 30 kilometers at the south of Latakia. And I think that Mr. Putin want to do in the Syrian coast what he done in Georgia. He want to create an Mediterranean Abkhazia, in fact, to have a foot in the Mediterranean Sea. And he will not try to invade whole of Syria, because it will be useless for him. Probably he would like to help the Syrian army to protect Aleppo, because Aleppo is completely surrounded by the rebel. I don't know if he want to enter in the game with the Kurdish. You know that the Kurdish want to have this continuum from Tigris to Afrin. Until now, they succeed to join Kobane to Kamishli, but there is still an area. Yes, between Kobane and Afrin. It's not a Kurdish territory. It's Turkmen and it's Sunni, Arab Sunni. But for the Kurdish, they want to join all these Kurdish territories, and I don't know if Putin will help them to succeed, because Erdogan is not very agree with this strategy. But the only mean to destroy, in fact, the Syrian opposition inside, the Syrian military opposition in the north of Syria, it's to close the border. You cannot have a successful counter-insurgency policy if the borders are open. So you can use the Kurdish to close the border if Turkey still continue to support the military opposition. So I think that Russia have two scenarios in Syria. One realistic scenario, which is the Syrian coast, Russian protectorate on the Alawistan, and a more offensive scenario, which is offensive around Aleppo. Damascus is under the Iran umbrella. Latakia Tartus will be under Russian umbrella. Without Russian troops, I think Latakia could fall, or could be divided in the Sunni rebel area and Alawite governmental area. And if Latakia falls totally or partly, it will be, of course, less easy to protect the Alawite territory, to create this Mediterranean Abkhazia. Like I said, it's sure that you will have many Alawite soldiers, many Alawite officers who will refuse to fight anymore in Damascus, in Aleppo, in Deraa, and they will come back to their village to protect their family. Because it was very clear in June, all the Alawite people that I meet say me, we don't want anymore an Aramo. Thank you.
Very good. Thank you very much. Actually, it's your description of the demography. It was fascinating, not least because if you read or listened to what Putin had to say today, there was a pretty powerful echo where in his discussion of how you deal with refugee problem coming from Syria, Putin said the way to deal with the refugee problem is to give comprehensive assistance, economic assistance, especially to the people who won't abandon their country. Namely, you give economic assistance to the people who are left in Syria, because everyone else abandoned them. But keep making Syria strong is the way to ensure that you won't have any further refugees leave. Of course, this plays exactly into the Assad strategy that you referred to a moment ago. Let me just pose a couple of questions and then open the floor to your questions. Jeff, could you just give us a very quick comment on precisely how Russian military deployments restrict the potential for American or Western ideas that have been floating around, including the creation of safe zones?
Sure. Sure. First of all, if the Russians begin flying outside of Latakia with combat aircraft and so on, it's going to impinge on U.S. ability to fly over northern Syria, unless there's serious deconfliction. If the Russians choose to start striking in northern Syria, for example, some of those targets could be in areas where the coalition flies, and that would force the United States to react to it in some way, or maybe it would simply acquiesce. The United States, depending upon how well deconfliction goes, the United States would have to maybe change its tactics, the way it operates, the way it supports flights over Syria. The environment with Russian aircraft in it would be, I think, much more dangerous, or potentially dangerous. Doesn't mean they would fight, but it would be something the U.S. has to think about it. On the ground, if Russian forces become involved, on the ground, there is a risk, depending upon where it happens, of course. But if it's in Idlib or in Aleppo, and maybe some other places, say around in Daraa or southwest of Damascus, then you have the situation where Russian forces could be fighting against U.S.-supported forces, CIA-supported forces primarily, or maybe the new Syrian force, and if anyone can find them. But if you see these kinds of actions where the Russians are striking under their very broad definition of who's a terrorist, and the United States is supporting these people, what happens? Is the U.S. government going to authorize strikes against Russian forces, or take other kinds of actions to disrupt Russian military efforts? So I think these are the kinds of things you could see under some circumstances. May not happen, but I think the potential's there. And
just one more for you, Jeff. Can you say a word about this announcement of intelligence coordination between Iran, Iraq, Syria, and Russia?
Well, with the exception of Iraq, I think this kind of coordination has been going on forever, effectively. Right? They're partners in many things. They talk to one another. Syria and Iran effectively have an alliance, a military kind of an alliance. Russians are involved in that. It also includes Hezbollah. So the fact that they're coordinating this, talking to each one another about intelligence isn't really surprising or even new. The context is somewhat new. The Iraqi context is different. We'll have to see what comes of that. But the issue, I think, here where this becomes really difficult is if it moves beyond intelligence sharing and cooperation into coordinating military operations. Then you've got another situation where the U.S. and the Russians could be flying in the same or adjacent whatever airspace. There's a possibility of conflicts there as well. So it's a complicating factor to me, but it's not a lightning bolt that's going to radically change the situation, in my view.
Andrew, in his speech today, President Obama referred to the process of managed transition and invited the Russians and the Iranians to be partners in helping to bring about this outcome. How would you characterize the state of U.S. diplomacy on this issue?
I think that it's not a secret that there's a fundamental disagreement between Iran and Russia on one hand and the United States on the other about what a transition looks like, primarily because there's severe disagreement on what a stable end state would look like, right? With the Iranians and the Russians on the one hand saying that Assad has to stay because of the structure of the regime, and that this would be the basis for some sort of preservation of Syrian institutions, which Putin talked about during his speech, and that this would allow, through this process over time, to use military force combined with economic incentives to put the pieces of Syria back together again. Obama was very clear. He said we cannot go to the status quo ante and to try and look at the way things were before because of Bashar's choices during the war. And I think a lot of the Syrian opposition obviously agrees with him on that. And I think actually most Syrians do because he only controls about 20% of his territory. I do not think there is any agreement on this whatsoever. I think there's some agreement on the threats that are coming out of Syria. There is some talk in the last few days about Assad going later rather than sooner in terms of the timing and the mechanism. And I think that was put forward by Secretary Kerry in the last few days, but that's not new. That's been floated out there for a few months. But I don't think that there's really anything has changed the divisions in terms of an end state. That severely complicates any kind of diplomatic effort on Syria, unless, of course, you're willing to accept partition. And that's something that the United States refuses to accept for obvious reasons, beyond the legal reasons, the security reasons. But absent some sort of common ground on that end state, I think we're going to have a divided Syria for some time.
And speaking of the concept of partition, Fabrice mentioned a Mediterranean Abkhazia. Anna, does that resonate in the Russian context, in how the Russians may be viewing what the opportunities and what the end goal might be here?
Yeah, well, this certainly resonates very well with how the Russians view the Kremlin's approach to international affairs. This idea of creating frozen conflict in one form or another is consistent with Putin's approach to international affairs. So. I think what's interesting to me is in my conversations, especially with the liberal opposition, they keep waiting for the West to say something, to give a little bit more pushback on Russia, and they keep hoping that, for example, one person I spoke to recently privately said, America won't have a Russia-Hezbollah alliance, for example. That just can't happen. Yes, it resonates, but the liberal elites are hoping that there'll be some pushback for Putin in this regard.
Okay, friends, let's. I'll turn the floor over to you, to your questions. We'll start over here with Robert Friedman on my right, and we'll work around. If you could wait for the mic. If I don't identify you, please identify yourself and identify to whom you are asking a question.
Yes, Robert Friedman, Johns Hopkins University. To Jeff, I'm an old military person, and it's a nice base. It's fortified by armored personnel carriers and tanks and 2,000 to 4,000 troops, perhaps. But it's still vulnerable. There have been rocket attacks already into Latakia, and there may be more. Now, do you envision, if you're the commander of the Russian base, sending out combat patrols around the periphery to protect against these kinds of rocket attacks? Do they have the kinds of drones that the U.S. has that can fire down on suspected positions? I mean, I can see the Russians perhaps getting sucked more and more into combat, whether they want to or not.
Well, it's an imponderable at this standpoint. We have not seen any serious attack on the Russian facilities in Latakia. There's been a couple reports, but there's no evidence that I've seen that anything really serious happened to them there. You know, my sense is if that does happen, and it may well happen, but if it does happen, the Russians will essentially respond with air. They have 12 Mi-24 attack helicopters at the airfield, or at the helicopter field now, and they have the Su-25. So I think their first response will be using air power. On the ground, I think they'll rely primarily on regime forces. I think it's very likely that they will embed ground combat forces, with regime troops. I'm disinclined at this point to think that they'll roll out of their garrison and try and go on search and destroy missions for rebels in Latakia province. Given the size of the buildup so far, what we've seen actually on satellite imagery is about a battalion, Marine infantry battalion, reinforced. That's not enough to go on any far-flung expeditions or expeditions of duration. So I think they'll respond, carefully to that. But if it becomes a problem for them, I think the Russians will respond because, in my view, they're to fight. It's not a political. It's not the force is not first and foremost a political force. It's a combat force.
Okay, over here on the left, please.
Thanks very.
That's it. That's fine.
That's on. Thanks very much. I'm Benjamin Norman. I'm the Syria First Secretary at the British Embassy. I'm sure some of us managed to watch Mr. Putin's speech at the General Assembly before we came to this event, and in it he launched suggested launching his own counter-ISIL campaign with Assad and Lebanese Hezbollah as the primary allies in that connection. In your view, does the Russian administration from Putin down genuinely believe, in an analytical way, that they can somehow manage a situation whereby Assad, hated across Syria, the deliberate progenitor of ISIL, can somehow win this war? Or do you think that actually they share the analysis of the British government, the American government, the French government, that until Assad is gone, we will never defeat ISIS, and the rest is just theatre? It's about saving face. It's about not setting precedent that people can be removed by external factors. Deep down, is there an actual acceptance that really he does have to go for this war to be over and defeat ISIL, or do they really truly believe that they can engineer some sort of South Vietnam-style victory in Syria?
All right. Who wants to address this first?
I could take a stab at it first, and I'm sure Anna has something to say as well. Maybe other. It's hard to tell. I think that the conversations that I've had with those around Russian circles indicates to me that that Putin's government now sees Assad as the basis for a whole country solution. Now, that is the rhetorical position. Primarily, I think, because it goes in with the legal structures and the legal reasoning, which Putin outlined and referred to today. I think, however, that in reality, very much like the Iranians, I think that they look at Syria as a divided country. There is essential Syria, which Fabrice referred to, and they see their interests in that essential Syria. And that's primarily in the western part of the country. That keeps Damascus from a catastrophic collapse, but it doesn't solve the ISIS problem. And it would seem now that if Russia wasn't intent on going on for a whole country solution, they would then be on the hook, right, after pouring money and men and so on into it. But I think that they've accepted that they can only influence part of Syria, not the whole thing.
Yeah, if I could add very briefly, I agree with Andrew. It's a little bit hard to tell. Based on the rhetoric that we see coming out of the Kremlin, it's clearly convinced that the United States is behind most ills of the world, including orchestrated coups and so forth. In fact, the protests in Syria, in particular in 2011, before they turned violent, resonated with Putin in a way that he was nervous that this is a precursor of what could happen to him in Russia. And a major impetus for Putin to sit in power is essentially preserving himself as well. He's actually very sensitive to public opinion, and even when his approval ratings are at the majority. Having said that, I also think the Kremlin has a very realist approach to international affairs. It tends to think that there's a lot of tit for tat. If you saw his interview yesterday on 60 Minutes, whenever he was asked on a few questions on Syria or Ukraine, for example, he was asked, do you support what Assad does? He said, well, tell me, what do you think of those who support the opposition only to oust Assad without thinking what will happen afterwards? Similarly, when he was asked about Ukraine, about Russia's troops on the Ukrainian border, he said, well, you have a military presence in Europe. So for him, there has to be a constant match. Whatever we do, he has to do as well. And I think that's kind of where his calculus is coming from.
I'd add just one thing to that, right, or my view of it. Let's say, based on what I see them doing now in Syria, I think Russia is prepared to fight for Assad to prevail, not to win in the sense of reconquering Syria, but to fight for the regime to prevail in what Andrew referred to as essential Syria. I think they have a fair chance of that because of the military balance in Syria and the way the dynamics of the war and so on. I think they have a reasonable prospect of securing that. My sense of Russian military things is not great, and most of it relates to World War II, right? But I think they're careful on the use of military force, and they have a long tradition of thinking about operations and military strategy and how to implement military strategy and so on. So I think they have in their mind. I think they've got a good notion about how to do this thing in Syria. Might be wrong, but I think they probably thought it through.
Okay, thank you. Scott.
Thank you. Scott Edelman, retired State Department officer. My question is mostly for Jeffrey White, but anyone else can jump in. We've talked about deconfliction with the United States and American forces. Following Prime Minister Netanyahu's recent visit to Moscow and his talks with President Putin, the two countries announced that they would put together some sort of deconfliction mechanism. It doesn't seem to be well specified. And my question is two-part. One, do you or anyone else wish to speculate on just how such a mechanism might work? And secondly, with Russia's primary purpose being to support the Assad regime, and with their major foreign supporter on the ground being Hezbollah, what are the prospects, if you could speculate on, of potential friction between Israeli and Russian forces?
Sure. What's been talked about and even reported is that the Russians would put a coordination cell inside the Ministry of Defense and presumably the Israeli Air Force to do the deconfliction. That would be the technical means. I've seen one report that said that that's been done. Right. Maybe that's all the reporting on Syria is hazy, right? But okay, but that's a logical thing to do, right? You put in some staff officers, and you give them a communications package, and you do deconfliction that way. the Israelis, I think, would find that perfectly useful and so on. The second part of your question, though, gets to the real rub of what could happen there, right? The Israelis, like to go around Syria and bomb places where they think weapons may be moving from and into Lebanon for Hezbollah. They also like to bomb Syrian positions and so on, and Iranians and Hezbollah guys in the Golan region, right? So in my mind, the Russian air and air defense presence in Latakia virtually vetoes any more Israeli airstrikes in Latakia province. The Russians aren't going to say, okay, you can come in and bomb 10 miles from our facility because it makes you feel good, or you think you have reason to. So I think my sense is that's probably out. I think the Israelis will be very cautious about fighting Russians or engaging Russians. The real complex situation is what happens in the Golan and southwest of Damascus, especially if Hezbollah is in there or Iranians are in there planning or conducting attacks on Israel. Do the Russians provide any cover for that or not? My sense is probably not. The Russians will be careful too. You have to remember, right, the ancient history right here, and that's the Canal War. And the Israelis and the Egyptians shot it out in the sky, and the Israelis killed Russian soldiers inside Egypt. Neither of them, I think, really enjoyed that experience. And I think they'd be reluctant to repeat it, and then they'll act to prevent that from coming to fruition. Accidents, maybe.
Again, just one more sentence about that. The main Israeli complaint has to do with Russian weapons to Syria that get diverted or sent on to Hezbollah that the Russians deny, and the Syrians say they have end user certificates, but of course the Israelis have pretty good evidence that they're sitting with Hezbollah. So there's a lot of room for back and forth between Israel and Russia on ensuring the security of these weapons. Melissa, in the middle.
Yes, Melissa Maley with
Mike, please.
Melissa Maley with Denton's. I'd like to ask kind of the other side of the question of with Assad staying, do the Russians really think that they can prevail and have the regime retake all the territory? But the flip side of that is, we're asking the Russians to basically deliver the regime. Is the West, is the anti-ISIL coalition, is the U.S. capable of delivering the other pieces of the complex, political landscape of the opposition?
Easy question.
Okay.
You mean all five of them?
No, the United States is not capable of bringing anyone from the opposition. The opposition is not capable of bringing the opposition. We have to be honest about this. The giant problem in the middle of our Syria policy is the fact that the opposition is as divided as it has ever been. However, the opposition has been going along with our diplomacy more recently, which was, and that was openly held out by the White House. So it's not without hope, but the problem is that the regime is almost a fixed player in all of this, and the opposition is not. And the opposition's ability to affect itself on the ground in terms of the political opposition is slight. Also, in terms of the train and equip program, we've been following that. Obviously, that's going very badly. I think the larger concern that I had about, especially the first troops that were sent in, is that when the troops who were trained by the United States were attacked by Jabhat al-Nusra, the other units did not come to their defense. That's a huge problem. Unless the United States is willing to make the political concessions to its allies in the region, Turkey, Saudi Arabia, Qatar, so on, concerning the fate of the Assad regime and the basis on which this plan is launched, I don't think we're going to have any progress in that regard. And I think that so now we're at a crossroads because the Russians with their intervention are propping up the regime. The question is, will we prop up the opposition, and if so, which part of it will it be? And I don't think we know that answer to that question yet.
Fabrice, you want to add anything on the opposition?
The Syrian, I share what Andrew said, because the Syrian opposition is so divided, the political opposition and the military opposition, that it's very difficult to have any influence on them. And you have concurrence inside the opposition. One group is getting money and weapons from Saudi Arabia. You have another group that is trying to make concurrence to this group, to get money from Qatar or Turkey, because in Syria we are in economic in war economy, and the only way to get money to survive for a lot of people is to make the war. So there is an internal dynamic in the conflict. Who can what West country have nothing to do with this, and the regime is still strong, is still unified. The Russians know very well that Assad is the key of the system. If you want to change Assad, Assad you don't want to go, and is the key of this system. If you change Assad, the system could be destroyed. And I don't think that the Russians want to take the risk to destroy this system if the West don't have nothing to give in exchange. It could be worse. So we are speaking a lot. Before we didn't want to speak with Assad. No, okay, Assad is a part of the solution, and in 6 months we will say, okay, Assad will stay, and we will see after.
Well, friends, on that note, we're going to bring this panel to a close. I'm quite sure that this topic is going to be with us for some time. So please join me in thanking our panelists for a discussion of Russian deployment in Syria. Thank you. Very interesting.